Good afternoon and welcome to the 207th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today I discuss Trump, Biden, and the path ahead with culture and politics writer Virginia Heffernan. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID Calls live every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can also watch COVID Calls on Facebook Live and on Periscope. You can hear COVID Calls anytime recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @USofDisaster or @COVID Calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics, and please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, January 21st, 2021, there are 2,084,012 deaths from COVID-19 globally, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. There are 24,538,028 cases reported in the United States, and there are 408,011 deaths from COVID-19 reported in the United States today, up from 403,952 reported yesterday. As a way to bring some humanity to the numbers, I've been reading a life story or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic in some way, and I do hope you got a chance to listen to the Inauguration Day memorial episode that we had yesterday. I'm going to continue that now. The headline is Crystal Hardy Flowers, social worker and child care provider in Sandtown, Winchester, dies of COVID-19 complications. This was written by Jacques Kelly and Hallie Miller. It appeared in the Baltimore Sun on January 4th. Crystal Hardy Flowers, a respected social worker and child care provider who founded a learning center and preschool in Sandtown, Winchester, died of COVID-19 complications December 31st at Sinai Hospital. The Randallstown resident was 55. Ms. Hardy Flowers was among the first providers in the state of Maryland to apply to stay open during the coronavirus pandemic to offer care for children of essential workers, said Laura Wheeldryer, executive director of the Maryland Family Network. Ms. Hardy Flowers also had chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a lung disease that can make breathing difficult. Ms. Hardy Flowers feared contracting the disease because of her underlying condition, Ms. Wheeldryer said, but continued working and serving the families until she was hospitalized around Christmas time. That's the part that hurts so much. She was there for everyone else, but the one time we wished we could help her, we couldn't, said Janera Key, a close friend whose children have grown up through the center. There was absolutely nothing that lady would not do, and she would never complain. Born in Brooklyn, New York, she was the daughter of Joseph Hardy and his wife Evelyn, a real estate broker and banker. She graduated from Edward R. Murrow High School and earned a bachelor's degree at Morgan State University and a master's degree in social work from Howard University. Ms. Hardy Flowers was a licensed social worker for many years before she decided to open a school. Friends said that as a social worker, she found that children needed early care and learning skills. Ms. Hardy Flowers founded the Little Flowers Early Childhood and Development Center in 2008 and ran services for children of all ages, including before and after school programs and summer enrichment. She integrated her social work background into the center to ensure that no child or parent fell through the cracks, those close to her said. She was one of the most compassionate, talented, and brave child care providers I know, Margaret Williams said. I met Crystal when I was executive director of Maryland Family Network. The Little Flowers Early Childhood and Development Center was first located in a Baker Street home. It grew, and Ms. Hardy Flowers relocated the center to Fremont Avenue at Carey Street. Ms. Williams also said she expanded her program from several children to almost 200. And eventually earned the highest quality rating in child care available from the state. She became a statewide advocate for quality, accessible, and affordable child care while demonstrating that it could be done even in an inner city community where families face many barriers to success. Before going into childcare, Ms. Hardy Flowers was a social worker who led a team of counselors caring for abused children at the Baltimore Child Abuse Center. She's as close to a saint as anyone I know, Miss Williams said. Linda Cowan Brown said, Crystal was the hardest working person I've known. It was just magical to watch her do a forensic interview. Kids were able to tell her their deep, dark secrets. Kids immediately felt safe around Crystal. In a 2014 Sun article about the center, Ms. Hardy Flowers described how a teacher witnessed children throwing classroom furniture, bookcases, chairs, tables, all were flung around the room. There was also biting, the article said. Ms. Hardy Flowers urged the staff to be patient with the children, who often were like any other preschoolers, dancing to music, playing tea party, and climbing onto a teacher's lap. The article also said the former social worker understood something that her teachers did not. The kids were growing up in Upton, Druid Heights, where police chases are common and sirens wake up kids like unwelcome alarm clocks at night. Almost every day, in some way, the kids were exposed to violence. It's not just bad behavior. It is not just defiance, Ms. Hardy Flowers said in the article. No, it is deeper than that. People just don't pick up chairs and throw them at you. Children don't just run out of the building. Many of these children are left with deep psychological wounds that can trigger physical ailments, the Sun's account said. Studies have piled up showing that in the tangle of tough, intractable issues like poverty and drug addiction, exposure to violence is a major factor damaging children's health. Ms. Wheeldryer of the Maryland Family Network said centers in more affluent parts of the state with wealthier clients might offer similar services, but Hardy Flowers' keen business acumen meant she never had to turn a parent away, Ms. Wheeldryer said. I don't think anybody thinks high-quality care would be synonymous with an old closed school built in Sandtown, Winchester, she said, but they worked with what they had. Courtney Miller, a mother of 4 and a little Flowers parent, said Ms. Hardy Flowers always helped her find ways to fill in the gaps when money was tight. I've gone through so much with her, and the one thing she never did was turn her back on me, said Ms. Miller, a city resident. A lot of people turn their backs on and don't want to be bothered with the neighborhood because that's where she was needed most. A lot of people turn their backs on and don't want to be bothered with a neighborhood that is considered urban or not great. She wasn't scared to be around none of it. She went right into that neighborhood because that's where she was needed most, Ms. Miller said. Crystal was just really extraordinary and very dynamic, and was outstanding in her ability to connect with families and to really listen to what they needed beyond childcare, said Nancy Pelton, director of the Baltimore City Child Care Resource Center. This is a very significant loss. Maryland State Department of Education released a statement Monday night saying MSDE is heartbroken to learn of this tragic loss within our early childhood education community. As our early childhood educators and child care providers have been working on the front line throughout the pandemic, Dr. Karen Semin had requested that MDH prioritize vaccines for those professionals along with teachers and school staff in the tier for essential workers. Survivors include Ms. Hardy Flowers' daughters, Ashley Flowers and Jasmine Hardy of Baltimore, her mother, Evelyn Hardy of Randallstown, 2 brothers, Joseph Hardy Jr. of Pennsylvania and Raymond Hardy of Glen Burnie, a sister, Anita Hardy of Columbia, South Carolina, and a grandson. Okay, we're going to turn to our discussion for today, and let me introduce my guest, Virginia Heffernan. Virginia is an accomplished journalist and cultural critic, a regular contributor to the New York Times, as well as the Wall Street Journal, Mother Jones, Politico, and other outlets. She writes a regular column for Wired Magazine and the LA Times, and is the co-host of the Trump Cast on Slate. She's also the author of Magic and Loss, The Internet as Art, which appeared in 2016 with Simon & Schuster, and this is her second visit to COVID Calls. Virginia, it's great to see you again. Thanks for coming back.
Scott, thank you very much for having me. You know, while you were reading that about Crystal Hardy Hardy Flowers, I was thinking that, maybe someday they'll do as they do on 9/11 in New York, a reading of kind of portraits in grief of all the people. And then it occurred to me, those are the deaths in 9/11 that are so few, almost vanishingly small compared to the numbers who have died of COVID. You couldn't do it. You'd need weeks to read them aloud.
that has something like that had occurred to me back in November. And I even thought, wouldn't it be interesting if, because there's a lot of people doing kind of podcasts and discussions around Memorial right now. And I thought, what would be interesting if we did read the names.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of started to work, and this was just back in November. I started to work out the logistics of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could do it, but it would be an enormous undertaking.
Like
Just
one
to
of
read
those
the names.
marathon readings of Ulysses, and while you were reading it, there'd be more names to add at the end. So yeah, I mean, that's astonishing, and we'll have to figure out, it'd be bigger than the Vietnam Memorial, but every name does deserve to be read, and I like that you do those obituaries.
Yeah, they're and you've written obituaries, right?
Oh yeah, I wrote obituaries for the New York Times for a while, and sort of in memoriam kind of pieces. I recently saw someone surface that I did for Don Knotts, but Anna Nicole Smith and Mary Tyler Moore. And then the most terrifying one that I did was about Leonard Nimoy, because you do not want to let down Trekkies by getting one thing wrong. I've never fact checked something so closely as like my Volcon translations of various things. And yeah, those obituaries are interesting because you enter another person's world, like we just did with this one that you read. As you know, my aunt died of COVID, Peg Laughlin, Margaret Laughlin, and she was included on the front page of the New York Times when they could still do, it was in May, when they could, I think when they hit, is that 100,000? When they could squeeze them in. Maybe it was less, but I learned so much about her from the obituaries. The Boston Globe did an obituary, and I actually connected with the obituary writer because she discovered all kinds of things about my aunt who never would have had a formal obituary written for her, but that, for the fact that she had died of COVID. So that was incredibly interesting. And she had worked with polio patients way back in the day, and had a brother die of pneumonia, and her father had worked with influenza patients. So there was a lot of connection to pandemics and disease in the family. But she was 91, and now her sister, who she roomed with in her nursing home, who's 95, has it. But older sister, but she's recovering.
Okay.
So, who knows?
I'm glad to hear that, and I'm really sorry for the loss of your aunt. And
thank you.
It's really something to discover things about family that you didn't know, but to discover them in that way, in such a public way. What was your reaction to that?
Well, I sort of teased my father. Believe it or not, he can handle it, but because he's always said, about Peg that she'd done physical therapy, and that she, I hope no one's listening in the family, but she didn't marry well. They're an old Catholic family. And so those were the two things I knew about her. And I found out about her whole life, her watercolors, her gardening, her work with polio patients, fearless work with polio patients, her travel to Tulsa to do that from Boston. And I've been teasing my dad because I've been saying, you'll never get a Boston Globe obituary. And, and she's a hero. And her obituary writer, who's a reporter for the Boston Globe, just thought she was extraordinary, beautiful pictures of her, and, just a way of kind of lifting up people that aren't ordinary. In fact, they're extraordinary, like the obit you just read.
Right.
I've
wanted to do a episode. I hope I'll get a chance to, with some of the writers of obituaries, because I worked for a while at the New York Times. I was on the Metro desk on this while I was writing my dissertation. I worked on Saturday nights on the Metro desk. My job was mostly to chase down Metro reporters from the rewrite desk. But one thing we would do is the obituaries would, I had some interaction with that, and I had no idea.
And if they're related to Metro, then of course you would.
I had never thought of it before, but of course, as you pointed out, if someone is getting a little older, and they're really significant in culture and politics, whatever. It's pre-written, or parts of it are pre-written.
Yeah, that's right.
That
Yeah.
absolutely blew my mind. Had never thought of that before until I talked with, until they said, "Oh, go pull this one," and I think it was for a president. And so that also made me think a lot about the writing that is happening with these obituaries right now.
Yeah.
These are written in the moment.
Where there's no paper trail for the COVID dead usually in their lives. I mean, as there's no paper trail for most of us, and you're putting together mostly in contact with the family, but you're looking through documents that of their birth certificates or whatever pictures, whatever else you can put together. And just, I don't know, the New York Times, actually, Susan Dominus, my friend, I don't know if you know her at the New York Times, put together right around Christmas, a piece about something like, I don't know, maybe 7 families that were had Thanksgiving without their relative. And now we're planning Christmas. So basically they shot their Thanksgivings and then talked about their preparations for Christmas. So that's why they had these beautiful pictures that have been taken at a distance. And they pulled the names out of a hat, which is really the way to go, because you, I don't know. She said, you weren't choosing people who were heroes, or,
Right.
and incidentally, one of the great things was not all the families said, the person was an angel. If there was a saint in heaven, this would be the person. Susan's favorite one, the last person in it, we could put a link up. The last person in it said, I never really understood my father. And she said, I don't know why you would want to write about our family. He was very aloof and he came to stay with us at the end. But come to think of it, we had this moment in the kitchen, and if you hadn't been asked to describe that, all because it was occasioned by this disaster,
right,
then she never would have found this moment. She would have said, he's not worthy of writing an obituary about, and suddenly he kind of was, and she still was unwilling in this very honest way to say that she, really missed him or understood him, but she had this moment. And then lots of other people that, like the woman you just read about, had extraordinary lives of service, and that you just could not believe, and setting up in trailer homes and small apartments, and what
right.
they were going to do with Christmas. It was really, really impressive.
I want to, we got talking already. I usually would ask people where they're calling from and how the pandemic is there. Can you give us just a brief take on that?
So I think the last time we talked, I was at my apartment in Brooklyn, and since then, like a lot of people, we acquired, like, very suddenly, a plague bunker where I am right now. Okay. I don't know if you can see. I'm almost like trying to make it clear, but it's a 1781 tavern. It's on. Very, very low ceilings, like a tavern.
Okay.
And we tell ourselves George Washington drank here, because I think everyone with a tavern tells themselves that. It's just a great place in near Rosendale, near Kingston, and when the kids don't have to be in school, they're in school remotely. You have all kinds of room to move around, and that's been interesting. And my partner's in construction and contracting, and he's found a lot of work to do up here for refugees from the coronavirus.
Imagine how is it there? The schools are open some of the time or not at all?
Yeah, they are doing a hybrid, and actually my daughter's in a kind of hybrid system, which takes us back to the city. She's in in-person class very rarely, but I haven't kept up much with the schools around here because we're really like feeling bunkered. We have a fire pit, so we have friends over, and fire pits, like fireworks last night, are one of the few things you can actually maintain the 6-foot distance, So, and also, by the way, masks in a smoky fire pit aren't the worst thing.
Yeah, perfect.
So you get a lot of bang for your buck. So we have like these very long s'more sticks, marshmallow sticks, and very long hot dog sticks. And we just break open the same thing, virtually every week, and have just neighbors or over, and that's been really fun.
The socially
So
distant
much
fire
at the
pit.
inauguration,
Yeah.
there was so much, and I don't, there are no upsides to this thing, but the way people have adapted, in the that you could see, like fireworks. They're so glamorous, and yet they're anti-elitist, and they can be enjoyed at such a far distance, and it's so exciting,
Yeah.
I hope everyone saw the Lady Gaga performance, with the fireworks, and Kamala Harris and her husband Doug Emhoff on one set of steps, and Joe and Jill Biden on another. So I don't know. I mean, I was just like, man, fireworks. That's way better than a black tie ball.
It's amazing I hadn't thought about these like socially distant but like socially meaningful things we've adapted to. Some of them we might have sort of thought we didn't care about as much anymore. I was thinking even back in the spring in New York, people banging on pots and pans every day.
Yeah, for the first responders. Yeah.
And I think there's an element of that which is the tribute to the first responders, but I also get a sense from talking to some people who did that it just felt damn good to be making noise with people.
Yeah. We were on the Hudson, in like a public boat that they have, where you can just sail around a little bit, and saw on the shores, this was the day the Biden victory was announced, there's just a little kid out there with a French horn, because why not?
Absolutely.
Music and light, right?
Yeah.
They carry. You don't need to be crushed up, and in fact, you should be at some distance from a fire or from a performer. And just understanding what can happen with the 6 foot interval, or farther. Like, what is that? At first I was like, it's too close for ping pong, but maybe you could play. It's too far for paper, scissors, rock. What happens at 6 feet? But we're sort of beginning to figure out what can happen.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the speech yesterday, the inaugural address. You are very always attuned to language. And there's the stagecraft and everything, which also had to be adapted to the pandemic, thankfully, and to the green zone, which is Washington, D.C. right now. So what's on your mind now that you've had a day to think about that speech?
Think about it. I mean, I was worried going in, and other people have warned about this, that, and I'm sure in your field, there's a lot of talk about trauma. And, I don't know much about the trauma rubric, either in mental health or in sort of thinking about generations and epigenetics. But it does seem like there's bound to be some effects of just the number of insults to the body, the brain, psyche, spirit, soul from the last 4 years, And I was worried, and some of my colleagues in journalism were personally worried. So like off the mic, worried that they would stay numb, or that they'd be sort of overwhelmed with emotions. The way they say, like, until the cavalry is coming. If you're being tortured, or if you're in great pain, you're in an abusive household, until the social work's coming, till that the FBI is coming, you can't let yourself kind of cry. And so some people were preparing for like a great catharsis, and then others, a very close friend, was worried she'd be numb, and so and not ready to feel it, not ready to let her guard down. So I was really curious, where I would be. And I wanted to be sort of open to all an expert in trauma was saying, the physical symptoms might kick in later. You never know. And it's really a time to attend to your body, which is a real, we're in a storm of deadly microbes. We're trying to figure out, we're inside a lot. And we're trying to, we're picking up on sensations in our throats that we've never been sensitive before. We're trying to, establish this herd immunity in all of our bodies, which is an interesting task for the collective body. So with that sensitivity of the body, I wondered what kind of pain might kick in. Now I'll say, and I'm curious for listeners and you, that I actually experienced moments of just euphoria. Just I wanted to talk to the me of 2 years ago. Just all the times it's just been so demoralizing, just incomprehensibly demoralizing to see Trump not get, convicted in the Senate, or, the pardons. And just each one, sometimes I'll just flash to Eddie Gallagher, the war criminal, or Death Camp Joe Arpaio, who started death camps, or you think about the families that have been separated, or even the children that have died in camps. And and then of course up to the, Trump promoting bleach for the virus. And all those things are like these terrible flashbacks, and that at each time you were just getting hit in the head. And so I tried to talk to the me that, learned that Mitch McConnell and the Senate was not going to indict, or not even have a real trial. And think of all the times that I just thought, I can't believe he's going to skate, or I can't believe this person's who had a discrimination lawsuit in 1973 and grabbed a woman, in her crotch in the early 80s. And that, that it's been 5 decades of this. And we all knew, everybody knew, and anyway, so with those insults in mind, I tried to talk to the me that was bearing those insults and the me that had the boot off our collective throat. Yeah. And she was happy, and I actually felt like I was in some new kind of Nikes that made it so that I was actually walking on air. I looked down at my little slippers and thought, are these even more comfortable than I thought they were? So they were really, and I saw Joy Reid on TV, barely able to repress a smile.
Yeah.
She just couldn't do it. For me, it was like watching my son at his bar mitzvah, just times of overwhelming pride, joy, confidence in America, yeah. So that's where that was. I mean, and then it's back to business, but there's still a little just like thing we can treasure, How did you feel?
Well, first, I mean, that's an amazing description. Thank you so much for that. I felt a lot of competing things happening at the same time. One, which you really encapsulated nicely, that how can an inauguration, how can just a process like this, in some way be any kind of a break? Because there's Trump, but then there's Trumpism and everything that goes along with it, and the enabling. And some of those enablers were right up there on that stage, on that dais. And so it was hard for me, I thought going into this, I'm like, this is going to be almost, in some ways, it could just be a continuation. If it's an inauguration without something else, some justice. So I was worried about that part of it, thinking about that. But I watched it with my oldest son, who he's home because school is hybrid these days, and he was just really excited to watch it. And that really just kind of I put all that other stuff aside and just tried to enjoy the moment and tried to be right there with the moment. And when they introduced the fire captain who came out and did the pledge.
Yeah. Amazing.
I'm a hard ass liberal. The Pledge of Allegiance. Come on. I can tell you all about the anti-communist stuff about that. And I just lost it.
Yeah.
I was just like, these very these symbols matter, and they matter. And if you're a person like you, I think like you are, that maybe we should be more jaded about these things and really cynical about these things. And I'm just not. I think it matters.
Yeah. I mean, there was an element of Gettysburg, I think, in the address, not in I'm so happy. We should be so happy that he didn't actually borrow from that speech, but more in the sense of reconsecration, and that they use that word. This was desecrated in the Capitol attack, and that those symbols that, the flag is doesn't belong to Republicans. I mean, I was happy not
Right.
to see those bullseye primary red and blue of the American flag, not so much up there on stage, because there were so many of those beautiful ochres and bright yellows on the
Mhm.
coats, purple. But there were just ways of reconceiving of this. Someone was saying there wasn't a ball for donors. There was a expansive and national sea to shining sea via the internet. The internet
Right.
is flawed, but it is not right now. It is all we have, and we've humanized it even more with our during this. And that was just throwing to Austin city limits. Come on, that was beautiful.
Yeah.
And then also, my mother's like you. She she doesn't even like the national anthem bores her, and she and she said, do you know this person, Lady Gaga? My mother's 84, got the vaccine, by the way, the first dose this morning.
Oh, great.
And
That's good news.
she was just overwhelmed. And that's what it took. It's like there was something up there. Kamala Harris's little joy at being sworn in, or just tiny moments. I mean, you probably have seen everyone with this Bernie meme.
Yeah.
Which is like Bernie Sanders. You've seen it?
Yeah, I love it.
It's so good, right?
Yeah.
Like in his mittens and in his little mask, sitting like unhappy but barely there, and dropped into all these settings. And I loved that too. And one person said, God, it's so good that we can just get back to bullshit.
Exactly.
It's just like when we're happy, we laugh, and Trump hasn't laughed. Trump doesn't laugh, physiologically doesn't laugh. And, Kamala Harris does, Biden does, Obama does, Michelle Obama does, Hillary does. Like, you can just think of all of them with their heads thrown back in laughter. And, it's just nice to see. It's nice to see those faces modeling for us, kind of joy and, love. But I also think, one slightly more pointed thing is a former Republican, never Trumper friend of mine, Windsor Man, said to me on election day, and after the announcement, man, you Democrats need to know how to win, and spike the football. And so I thought, I need to be like a soccer hooligan for a day and just kind of like a dick, and just be like, we won, like Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that was having Dave Grohl and Bon Jovi and the Boss on one program. That's kind of our version of that, right?
That's our version, yeah. And
like the Boss is not going to perform, and Gaga. Yeah.
There was a hyper manly moment with her. I can't remember what she was saying, but she just punched the line really hard.
Yeah.
And
plus that gold mic. I mean,
yes. I mean,
there was some football spiking. It's true. We don't do it maybe in the same way, but there was some of that. But then that quick pivot, the other part by the afternoon, where they showed Biden and he had the stack of executive orders. That was a different set of emotions, and I wonder how you felt about that. 'Cause I just felt like, okay, now I can get back to work.
That is, I mean, what you said about, well, if Biden's just there glad handing with Mitch McConnell and it goes back to business as usual, that's not going to work. But, I was thinking of an icon for Biden's first 100 days, and it's like the undo symbol on Google Docs. Because live by fiat, die by fiat. Live by executive order, die by executive order. There's a great list for your listeners in Politico of what Trump actually did that we didn't notice. And I warn you, there's some good things, which was very strange. Just by accident, backed into making it easier to pursue money launderers, strengthening Obamacare by accident. But also, if you like, something about medical software has been vastly improved. And then, of course, all the bad things, which are, I mean, the moves he made on the environment are terrifying, down to just in crazy details that I had no idea about. But a lot of them can be undone. A lot of them can be undone with the stroke of a pen.
Right.
Re-enter the Paris Accords, make a path to citizenship, end the Muslim ban, and all those orders that Biden that Biden did, which were undos, you know? And also that I suggest that he didn't have, in spite of the kind of blowfish effect of Trumpism, he didn't have legislative support. He didn't even have popular support for his silly repeal and replace or build a wall or hang her, lock her up. Those and the executive orders could just be undone with a pen, because who was out there, even among the Capitol terrorists, saying we got to keep the Muslim ban? One thing I want is the Muslim ban.
Right.
Everybody had forgotten about whatever policy they pretended to be interested in, and so seeing that undone, you're right, that just kicks it off on a happy note, or on a assertive note.
Do you think then, though, that, I mean, I want to sort of get you to say a little more about what you think about Trumpism. You've been thinking about and talking about this constantly now for years, for the whole administration, and we should talk about the Trump cast and some of your headlines coming out of that and what's coming next with that. We'll get to that, but I do want to know, I mean, because that does strike me the way you characterize that. So many things that were done by executive order, even some things you might call achievements, which he didn't think to take pride in, or maybe he wasn't even aware it happened. He just signed the paper, but it's interesting because, so by legislative measure, I've got to agree with you. I mean, whatever was on his agenda, he failed at most of it, but a lot of what was on his agenda wasn't legislative in the first place. It was cultural. It was aggressive. It was things that aren't captured by legislation, and he never trusted Congress anyway. Most of what he wanted to accomplish probably would have been accomplished in the Capitol building. He thought it would be accomplished on the deck of a battleship somewhere, maybe, or in the Rose Garden, or on his Twitter account. So
just by somehow.
So what is the legacy going to be? Well, I know it's very close in time, but what's your first pass at that?
For some reason, and I've been doing Morning Joe sometimes lately, which is like a lot of fun. And I think I connected sort of with Joe Scarborough about, I think it's crumbled and, crumbling. And I think we will not, in 6 months, the way to test it is give a quiz to Trump voters and say, explain what Burisma is. Explain what the Dominion voting machines are. Explain who the DA in Philadelphia was and why he represents a problem. Explain what the lizard people are. Explain what hydroxychloroquine is. And these. So there's some books that I just kind of read in graduate school and fell for all time. So I don't even know, maybe Thomas Kuhn is canceled by now, but if he is, don't tell me, because the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in which Kuhn outlined what a paradigm shift is one of those books for me. And, let's just think for a second about the paradigm at work in Trumpism and how it might fall apart. So one of the great parts of that Kuhn book is that, the kind of signature paradigm shift is the one between Ptolemy's, geocentric universe and Copernicus's heliocentric universe. What Kuhn points out is that the Earth at the center, the geocentric universe, his model could still explain all the phenomena of the night sky. It was just very, very wordy. It was like harvests and the Pleiades and whatever. And it had to make sense of all these contradictions. Yeah. And the reason your mind slipped to Copernicus was not, at least in Kuhn's telling, was not that it was just manifestly true or that you went and verified it with telescopes. It was just a more elegant solution to all these problems. And when something becomes inelegant, groaning under all these little notes and things, like I think of Bannon's notes about what needed to happen to enact this cultural shift that he was imagining. And it was just so extensive and crazy and full of contradictions. And then Trumpism, which starts with build a wall, grounds out in this QAnon fantasy of lizard people that Tom Hanks eats children, that JFK Jr. is coming back from the dead, even that Biden might be Trump in a mask. I don't know if you saw that.
Oh, I missed that one.
Yeah,
Oh.
Biden and Trump have traded places.
That's
and
the Scooby-Doo version, I guess. That's the
Scooby-Doo version. Although, by the way, I like that one. Go ahead. Wish for the demise of the person in the Biden mask. Wish for the success of the person in the Biden mask.
Yeah, sure.
The person with the Trump face, let's let prosecute him. And we can all agree that the person who looks like Trump, is if you want, he's the good guy. He's the bad guy. The Biden face is the good guy. And you can call the Biden face whatever you want. Anyway, so, when things get to that point, you sound like a nattering lunatic, but you also are making a case that is not like we were talking about your parents. It doesn't happen in simple, arresting monosyllables. It's really hard to follow.
Mm-hmm.
And let me give you one more example of this. You probably saw Luke Mogelson's incredible piece of reporting on what happened in the Capitol that day and the day of the terrorist attack. And what he noted, he didn't make a lot of this, but there were 3 examples where the insurgents just had no idea what they believed. No idea of strategy, tactics, ideology, just no idea. They were the beginning when they looked at Ted Cruz's desk and rifling through things. And one of them said, something like, Ted Cruz is a rhino, and of course he let us down. And if someone reads it out loud, Ted Cruz wants to reject the votes or question the votes in Arizona. And they are like, look at him, a total wait a second, he's on our side, let's go. And it was like that from then on. There was another time they're taking pictures down from a church, and one of them reads like a little passage from the Bible on the church. Yeah. Taking a picture of Breonna Taylor down, fine. Reading a passage from the Bible, wait, we're Christians.
Yeah, we can't do that.
Christian, right? And finally, of course, I thought we loved cops, or do we hate cops? Do we crush them? Do we not? And when you get to that point, leaving morality out of it, even leaving truth out of it, when it just takes that much energy, psychic cognitive energy, to hold on to what the fuck you're doing, you're not in a great place for an ideology. And you probably saw the Proud Boys and QAnon have given up on Trump. It goes like this. They said today, he's a loser. He's a total loser on their message boards. And QAnon people said, look at that. No Q, no miracle, no nothing.
So it's live by the grift, die by the grift in the end, as you see it then with Trump? I mean, I was trying to explain to one of my kids today, we got into this, we were driving, so I guess he had to listen to me. He didn't have a choice. Anyway, I subjected him to sort of my history of Donald Trump. Yeah. And as I told it, I was surprising myself. He was a made-up businessman who became a made-up businessman on TV, who became a made-up president. But the whole thing was a grift.
Yeah.
I just don't see much more there.
I mean,
so I'm not surprised that Q and Proud Boys and others, there's a parasite-host relationship there, and he's not that interesting anymore.
He's not that right. He can't be fed off anymore in that same way. I mean, I think I might see it a little differently. I just tried in a column in the LA Times to talk a little bit about whether Trump himself and Trumpism had adaptive or counter-adaptive features. Because my fear all along, leaving righteousness out of it, is justice adaptive for the species, right? Because we've been thinking about this so much with pandemics. And or is it counter-adaptive? Is the way to go, leaving morality out of it, just as an animal, to rally around your tribe, your race, reject all, build barriers to the acquisition of resources for other races, and rape and pillage where possible. And in that case, is the greediest, like, does the race go to the greediest? Does the race go to the solipsist, who can barely see anything outside himself except for people with his own name? I'll tell you where, and it's probably the last time we talked, I'll tell you where I thought this is counteradaptive. Making masks political. What a
Right.
crazy thing to do. What a suicidal
Total.
decision,
Yeah.
I mean, if they were putting themselves in special bubbles and Trump gave only the red states these incredible, the new antivirals, and that, I might have thought, oh, this is horrible. Only, this is going to be survival because they've created the Trumpites have created a system where only the Trumpites survive.
Right.
The best medicine, the best antivirals, the best protections. What if they had South Korea up there in North Dakota and in Oklahoma?
Yeah.
But no,
No.
the death
Their
drive
own.
was strong. The death drive was strong, and there were examples. People who keep a lot of guns in the home tend to die by gunfire, and people who don't wear masks tend to die by COVID, whatever their politics. And somehow they latched politics onto wearing a few square inches of cloth on their faces.
So
Amazing.
I want to stay with this a little bit and think about, since we're talking legacies here, let's talk about language.
Oh yeah.
One of my grandmothers was called MAGA.
Oh.
I've never said this on this program.
Huh.
I haven't talked about this much, but it's an anger I've carried since 2017 because I couldn't say her name. I couldn't say grandma, whatever. It came out MAGA when I was 2 years old or whatever. And so she was just MAGA.
Yeah.
And I remember when MAGA first appeared, the Make America Great Again and the red hats and everything. And I thought, first of all, this will never fly. I mean, this is not creative at all. It's too simple. I was really wrong about that. And I was wrong about MAGA as something that people could get behind. And I got very angry, too, that they'd taken my grandmother, the thing I called my grandmother, and they've appropriated it to this quasi-fascist movement. So I'm taking back MAGA. I'm going to say that now.
I think there's actually a yoga instructor or something on Instagram who is called MAGA and did the same thing. So you and she standing in solidarity, yes.
There's a lot of words out there, though, that are, and I think presidents, if they're good, and if they're good with language, they take certain phrases, they take certain, turns of phrase, and even individual words, and they make them theirs.
Yeah.
In American speech, in American political idiom. Trump's done that with some words, although maybe they're not the words most presidents would want to own. But I wonder what you think about, his impact on language, and even do you use language differently now that you spend so much time talking about and writing about him? I mean, words like wall and great and proud and beautiful and phrases like enemy of the people, which were very much in circulation. Obviously, a word like great, we shouldn't really pause over the use of that word, but I do now when I use it.
Interesting. Yeah, you're right. Like very kind of bombastic language, grandiose language, sort of heavy metal attitude that is that just has lost its luster. If you ever felt like watching Rocky, or just getting into some 80s spirit just for fun, it feels yes, it feels perjured, and it just we should be lucky that it's adaptive, that we lost nothing's fun about that anymore. I've heard some of the rappers who use Trump as a byword for just kind of money and power and machismo, have sort of rolled that back. One of the ways that I saw that happen early on was just the name Trump. Mary Trump, the sort of dissenter in the family, the niece who's written more than critically about her uncle, said that she loves her name, Mary Trump. And it's the first line in the book. And, there is some thumping lyricality to it, trumpet and, thump. And, we didn't get anywhere calling him Drumpf or, trying to take away from the punch of that name. But what I really didn't like is how we quickly took it on as even Hillary Clinton used love trumps hate, right? So like repeating, you took it on as some kind of trump card, which is, I think, Ivanka Trump's book. And as if he just had a high card, and also Trump's beat everything. So it's like, it just has this scorched earth idea to it that I feel like we've just said it so many times. I called our podcast today Redacted Cast yesterday, because I don't want to say it sometimes. I just don't want to say it. That's just a simple one that I want out of my head. The other thing is, after Charlottesville, Trump said, I call this group, as if he had made it up, Antifa, right? And then he says it again to teach you it. Antifa. It becomes his word. Antifa is a beautiful European set of ideas. And I had Mark Bray on the show, who's an expert on and sort of hung out with Antifa, many of whom are environmentalists, for the 10 years prior, and sort of thinking about our relation to fascist speech through Antifa. And now you hear the FBI say, this is more of a set of ideas than it is like a terrorist group. But Trump made it a terrorist group right then. And then the other thing is fake news, which was actually a useful idea in 2016 to describe news that looks like news but isn't, like with, it could be an ad that it pretends to be, kind of in the format of a news story, or it could be some kind of propaganda, or it just could be nonsense to get you to click on something with, like, all the framework of a headline and all that stuff. And that was really useful to talk about the cognitive dissonance of Facebook. But then fake news just became his way of saying news I don't like. And, nobody would want to say fake news now. It sounds like his reality distortion field, and you're just in this weird world with him.
I remember specifically that moment of the fake news being rolled out as a concept, because it's very useful. In fact, that's what is the amount of research that's being done by brilliant people like Kate Starbird right now, for example, on disinformation. This is the ecosystem we live in. Disaster researchers now take that on board. Like when we study disasters now, we're going to have to not just study the disaster, we're going to have to study the multiple iterations of truth that are swirling around with this disinformation. So he was onto something there, and then he just flips it around, exactly as you said. He takes a useful concept and just makes it, anytime somebody says something mean about me, fake news. An enemy of the people. To have him standing up there at these rallies and pointing out the press pen and saying, enemy of the people, you just think his pronoun is flipped.
Yeah.
And
he refers to himself, uses the people as a proxy for himself lots of times. And the most egregious was when E. Jean Carroll's lawsuit against Trump, the private citizen, or the citizen who on his @real Donald Trump private citizen account had defamed her. So it was the title of the case was E. Jean Carroll versus Donald Trump. And Bill Barr made it, versus the United States of America. Just the saddest thing, and like, as if, I don't know, as if it was going to be like the people, the way they say in court, the people of the United States of America did not rape E. Jean Carroll, and do not pay taxes to the person that did, and that was incredibly sad. So enemy of Donald Trump, became enemy of the people, and useful words get debased like currency.
I want to remind everyone you're listening to COVID Calls. I'm talking to Virginia Heffernan today, and you've got a piece that just came out. I think it came out yesterday in the LA Times, or maybe it was last week, about the commission. And I'm just going to read your idea for a January 6th commission. I'm going to read a line from this. You said, much has been made of how divided the nation is right now, but it's more accurate to say we're exhausted. COVID-19 has afflicted more than 23 million Americans. Joblessness is double what it was a year ago, but we're exhausted by lies. The American public has paid a high emotional tax as we've witnessed the burial of truth again and again. So thinking now of concrete steps going forward, One of the ideas that you put on the table is this January 6th commission. What would it do?
Okay,
What
so
like that?
if I can back up to a personal story from November, I was burned in a fire. So we've been lighting a lot of fires here, and I was, candles and self-care kind of things, and I was lighting some birthday candles, and my nightgown, very flammable nightgown, caught on fire, and so part of my leg was burned, and just a very weird experience. I hadn't suffered like a burn on a significant percentage of my body ever.
You wrote about that in Wired, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and you're okay?
I'm okay. Yeah, the one last patch hasn't healed, but yeah. It doesn't bother me at all now. But the if any of your listeners have been burned, the weird rallying, your body's struggling so hard to get back to homeostasis, and it was traumatic enough that I passed I think this is the first time I could have touched what a trauma is. I passed actually I watched The Simpsons, and I saw some clowns kind of clownishly burning up on The Simpsons, and I thought, this is an amazingly disturbing show that I should never show my kids, And then I saw a restaurant called Flame, and I felt the same feeling. And so a friend named Sarah Burns emailed me, and I thought, that's so inconsiderate and triggering. And yet I'm over it. I have a candle burning right now, and I'm very I did aversion therapy. And one of the things I did was call a psychiatrist or call my therapist and ask her, what I should do to preempt trauma. And what she had me do was amazing. And I wonder if it's a strategy that could be used in disasters. She had me walk through everything that happened in the finest detail, because I wanted to tell someone that, the wick of the candle had been slightly buried in the wax, and I knew Richard was coming down the stairs, whose birthday it was, and I was kind of irritated, and I wanted to, and it was outside, and the candles were going off in the wind, and I wanted to dig under it, the way you sometimes do to flip up the wick in a birthday candle, and I should have blown out not had the match lit, and I should have picked it out myself with my fingers when nothing was lit, but that happened, and then I think the top of the match came off and lit the thing. And I wanted to tell someone that, because I wanted to get to the moment of how did this happen, because it happened so fast. Anyway, she had me walk through it in just excruciating detail and simulated at least interest in every part of it, including Richard, my partner, told me to stop, drop, and roll. I briefly thought, I know the slogan, stop, drop, and roll. That's what I wanted to say to him. And then I stopped and I dropped, and it went out because it was behind me. Or actually, he clobbered me with a thing, and it went out. I had in my head for the whole rest of the day, I never rolled. The fire was out, but weird. And of course, time slowed down and all that stuff.
Sure.
And I went quickly to find Aquaphor, and then I got in a really, really cold bath, and that's all I felt I wanted to be in. I got blue, like a lot of people. I regulated my temperature in a weird way, but Richard carried me and wrapped me up, and we survived the day. And what she said is, look at everything you did right. Look at every single second that your body and mind were attuned. Because as long as humans have used fire, they've been burned.
Sure.
And the body with these beautiful blisters, that rose to cushion, they're supposedly bubble wrap. They're not bringing fluid so much as this kind of this cushion that will allow the skin to heal itself. And I was looking at them, they're these, they're gaudy, so yellow, the blisters. And they look like these gaudy jewels. And I just thought, no human could make this, and she had me go through, look at all those times that you and Richard had this synced mind about the stop, drop, and roll. And some of the communication was how to keep the kids from seeing it and traumatizing them. And by going back over it, I felt better. And the way this leads to the January 6th panel, January 6th commission, is what the hell happened in the Capitol? I just want to know every single part. And sometimes you can't have justice if you just throw all the people in jail and call it over. I want a Warren Commission or a 9/11 Commission style report that's this long, that nobody reads maybe, but you have it on your shelf and you know that someone has done all the scholarship and the forensics and has all the footnotes and knows who gave the orders and knows who can tell the Oath Keepers from the Proud Boys, from the 3%ers, from Donald Trump himself, and knows what a dog whistle sounds like, all the way up to, did that guy really tase himself in the nuts to die? And was he really stealing a picture of Tip O'Neill? And, what was some of the dialogue that some of the reporters captured with, the Getty cameraman and and Luke Mogelson. And I think that the healing in sorting out, like they did at Chernobyl, like exactly what went wrong, and how can we use an understanding of everything that happened and everything we did right. The Congress went back 5 hours later to a place that was wrecked and desecrated and sacked. All of them went back and did their procedural work. I mean, how crazy? How could you talk people going back into a school after a school shooting, or or Chernobyl after the meltdown, to do the work they had to do? So, there's a lot to be learned from it for other instances of domestic terrorism. And I think the way you learn it is by telling the story in all its excruciating detail.
Were you watching? I mean, did you watch that 4 hours?
Yeah. Yes, I couldn't. Oh, yes, that's right. I was doing a Trumpcast with Jay Rosen, the kind of media expert. And he came on and I said, are we going to do this? Or do we have to do we need to be present to this other thing? And he said, he's very low key, and he said, I think we should do it. So we did it. And then I went back and then watched as much of the footage as I could, just parse what's happening. Are they really crushing cops? They love cops. And who are these people? And, just understanding so many of them are women, just like looking into the faces, looking at the costumes, what is this? Where does it fit in my idea of the Bastille or Fort Sumter, or, what is, like, until you describe it, what's the response? If it's a kind of protest that got out of hand, it's one thing. If it's a suicide mission, the rioters lost a few of their own in it. If it's a occupy the Capitol, is that an act of war? And so I think all of our nervous systems and vocabulary and history and whatever had to sort of put it into some kind of place.
I really want the commission. I love the op-ed, and I wonder though, why stop with that day? I feel like we need that commission for every single day, going back to a year ago, and I wonder. And it sounds like an impossible labor, and yet I feel like, well, it's been an impossible time. How are we ever going to make sense? I want that same thing you're calling for, but I want it for April 5th, and I want it for November 1st, and I want it for every single day. The timeline, the depth, back to what we were talking earlier about the importance of the obituary and the reading the names and the saying of the stories.
Yeah,
we need all of it.
I mean, for coronavirus, I mean, that's a really amazing idea. There were some people, never Trumpers, who wanted a commission about the 2016 election. And the reason for a commission, and of course, prosecutions also in this case, and they have imprisoned more than 100 people, arrested more than 100 people, and there's hundreds more FBI cases open on 1/6. But things that are meant to tilt into prosecutions. You hire Robert Mueller, and it's meant to end in prosecutions. You don't hire a prosecutor not to do that. And the adversarial system is a wonderful way at arriving at a certain kind of truth. But another way is scientific method. As you say, that you've said this, which is we have a metaphor set that is very available to us. It's medicine, it's care, it's science, and instead of thinking of the pandemic as a case of individual failures by kind of criminals and felons, which is possibly one way to look at some of this, but to just look at it as something we need to understand the science of so it doesn't happen this way again. Just that. Not so that we can see Trump's head on a pike, although, lots of us want that, but so that we can, and so that we can share data with other countries making these same kind of calculations, and other countries with despots who failed in the same way we did, like Brazil. That's what these Never Trumpers wanted from a commission, which is what can we share with Estonia or France or other countries in which elections are interfered with by the Kremlin and other military intelligence. What can we learn? And that thing that we learned is not about getting Roger Stone in jail, but all kinds of things to do with election security and with the information system that could be of use.
I think that's the other part of this that maybe is one of the keys to repair from this era, which is to say, you take the insanity of what happened at the Capitol, and actually let's just look at it forensically. We have to do that. And yes, the gestures, it's a way to sort of take the gestures and the things that I felt like what we were talking about earlier about language. We've had to use the language because we've been using it to describe the phenomenon that's in front of us, which is Trumpism. But now let's take the time to go and put those things all in context. And I believe, of course, I believe this. This is kind of what we're trying to do with this podcast. But I believe there's a power in that analysis.
Yeah,
I'm not going to give up on it. And that's why, again, I love your idea of the January 6th as a place to start.
Yeah, because you have it contained in a day, what happened when they planned the day, and then what happened when they got up in the morning, what were the failures of the Capitol Police, the National Guard, Pence.
The 9/11 Commission report is like that. And one of the really, I always thought, powerful things about the 9/11 Commission report, it's not perfect, but you start the morning with the terrorists. Basically down to the level of what did people eat for breakfast? It's like, what was the cloud structure like? What was the temperature? We need all that.
And I'm thinking right now, and maybe we're coming up with a project, but a coronavirus commission, with you would just be incredibly satisfying. And there is, I can think of people, and I'm sure you can think of so many people, Laurie Garrett. I think sometimes of Bandy Lee, who's done, just the research on the kind of psychosis or mental incompetence of Trump is really amazing and detailed, and put together something like this. And by the way, you can recoup the cost because the 9/11 report and the Mueller report were #1 bestsellers.
Yeah, huge bestsellers, right?
That is part of healing. So it's it could be service, a bestseller, and a way to
there you go. Trauma. We're coming up on time. I've overstayed my welcome with your time, I'm afraid, but I so much enjoy talking with you. I do want to ask, though, now that you have been doing the Trump cast, and you've got, I think, one more.
Yeah, one more coda. We had Ibram Kendi on yesterday.
Great.
Who, the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, and he is very, very interesting on, are things getting better or worse? So sometimes a little bit like you're saying, well, we're just papering over the problems of kind of neoliberalism. The neoliberalism is now back in place, but maybe that will, just conceal the real problems in this country that need to be treated with more radicalism. And what he says is they're getting better and worse at once. And that is a very interesting part of American history, is that racial progress, where racial progress is a proxy for all progress, racial progress and racism grow in tandem. And I thought that was a great way to wrap the show. I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but that was yesterday. And then there'll be a final small coda. And then what's next is unclear. And I think it's taking lots of deep sighs of relief that Trump and Trumpcast are no longer ascendant, that they're over. And also, I'm just talking to a huge number of interesting people about projects, maybe on culture, on the things I'm actually trained in, that will cool off the nervous system. I think we've been kind of culturally underserved in this like highly political time.
Right.
And if politics are downstream from culture, I think we should drink from the upstream water, right? The dirty downstream.
I have a mixed reaction to what you just said, because obviously I want you to do the work that you want to do. But on the other hand, you've been such a crucial Trump whisperer for everybody in these times. Knowing who to have on to talk to, knowing how to ask the right questions, knowing how to turn that into the other writing that you've done. And it is a very highly specialized skill set. People who pay attention like you do, not just to policy and the politics and the stuff you can get by reading closely, but really to listen to what a politician or a cultural figure says, or a politician who becomes culture.
Yeah.
To what he says. And it's surprising, I think, to me, how quickly people lose that facility, or how little they pay attention. It just becomes background.
Yeah.
We need your skill set in that regard, but we got to give you some time off. I get it.
Yeah. I don't think the lessons, and that's what I mean about the culture, that we're culturally underserved, is that I think was a problem before Trump. That, there was some time when there was a map of the US to see what people in what states watch on television. And there was a lot of premium TV in some of the blue states. But it was all different. Some network TV, but and this is fiction TV. But in the red states, they only had Duck Dynasty. There's no like the reemergence of the Hallmark Channel as a touchstone, as a slow return to something that just cools off the nervous system, and it's like Biden. He's just like chicken soup, just like saying just sweetheart things, quoting from bullseye poetry, making us understand the national anthem again, Hallmark. And, we really, really, really need that because they were underserved, people in red states. And this is not to be sympathetic, but just to be descriptive. Turn to the porn and snuff of Fox News, hyper stimulating, leggy hosts and bursting with rage, Sean Hannity. And, that's very dramatic, but it doesn't do what art should do, doesn't do what culture should do.
And will the next act for Trump, do you think itself be some sort of form of art? Will he take this to a new level, try to create a new political party, which will be a shell corporation, or is he going to go back on TV with a Apprentice too? I mean, does art? I don't know the right way to say this, but art becomes politics, becomes art again somehow, because he is,
I think,
truly a core an actor.
I think he ground out. We had a lot of him. I think the show is canceled.
The show's canceled.
I think the show's canceled. I also think he's got a lot on his hands with prosecutions of himself and family in the States. And also he's got some debt at Deutsche Bank that I understand they might be in the mood for some asset seizure. And that can get in the way of a showbiz career.
His creative time might be a little limited in these next.
Exactly. It might not be the time to try to convince NBC to take him back.
Well, I want to thank you, Virginia, for taking time to talk to us. And the pandemic, this COVID calls is about the pandemic, and we're moving into another phase of that. So I hope we can, as we get into the spring, get you back another time. These conversations are mapping out the sort of different phases that we're in with the pandemic. And I feel like you're just one of the essential people to help us make sense of it. Thanks a million for your time today.
Scott, I feel the same way that you're the pandemic whisperer, and you know, in this way, this show is something of a commission itself. So thank you so much for your service, and it's good to see you again.
Stay healthy, everybody. You can catch COVID calls every weekday, 5 p.m. Eastern time, except tomorrow when we will not be on, but catch us again on Monday, and I'll put up on Twitter all the details for that. We're going to be continuing our congressional discussions as we go into next week as well, so please do join us on COVID calls for that, and please do catch Virginia Heffernan's LA Times columns, her Wired columns, and her Trumpcast, which will have its CODA episode, as she said, dropping on Slate next week. Stay healthy, everybody. We'll see you on Monday, 5 o'clock.
Thank you.